Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And right now, we are reviewing two new records. We're going to be talking about the newest album from 100 Gecs, 10,000 Gecs, so many of them. We're also going to be talking about the new Yves Tumor album, Praise the Lord Who Chews But Which Does Not Consume, or simply Hot Between Worlds.
Oh,
Thanks for that.
nailed it. I need like the in response to like 100 Gecs, I need like the clip of David Lynch in Twin Peaks being like massive quantities. That's how many Gecs.
Massive quantities of Gecs.
Too many. So 100 Gecs, I'm sure anyone who's watching doesn't really need to be introduced to them, but I will anyway because fuck you. 100 Gecs are a duo. Missouri, originating from Missouri, from St. Louis, now based in Los Angeles and just screaming California to me, and basically everything that they do.
Yeah.
Comprising of Dylan Brady and Laura Les. Dylan Brady, who before 100 Gecs was primarily known as a producer within and adjacent to the hyperpop realm, worked with, and worked within the kind of sphere of artists like A.G. Cook and Danny L. Hall in the hyperpop scene that was so big from like 2016 to 2018, 2019. In fact, hyperpop was kind of starting to die down around the time that 100 Gecs became a thing with their instant cultural milestone record 1000 Gecs, which basically took the world by storm. I remember this like piecemeal because I remember following this like as it was happening, each of the developments in the gradual ascension of this project as well, because it started off being this very online thing, as you would expect as well, localized to very online communities and particular shit posting pages and Reddit forums, and then just metastasized following the release of this project on 31st of May 2019, when eventually it became so talked about within the online Zoomer sphere of, weirdo eccentric music, especially because we were sort of, I guess if it had already happened, but we were really on the cusp of TikTok and TikTok related forums taking over the way that music was beginning to be consumed and produced as well. So it was this kind of like nexus point for a new, I guess, shift or movement in online music culture. And 100 Gecs kind of came around and sort of climaxed, I guess. This is right in the wake of Billie Eilish's huge ascension as well. And the conversation around Billie Eilish, which most people wouldn't associate it with 100 Gecs, but like culturally, she and her music and her debut album was the thing that kind of started getting, the music critic and music journalism sphere more broadly talking about, young Zoomer music essentially, and taking it seriously as real art that was representative of a particular era that we were existing in. And so, that Billie Eilish record got so much hype and so much love, and there was this kind of afterglow of that in the kind of critical musical sphere where all these music journalists were kind of hypersensitive to, we cannot miss whatever the kids are into. We need to be able to pick up on it, and we need to be able to sense it. And so this was the perfect breeding ground for 100 Gecs to basically explode both within online circles and beyond that as well, and become this legit music phenomenon. I say that, inverted quotes as well, because regardless of, how big they got with music critics or whatever, we're still talking about stuff that, a considerable minority of the people on the planet Earth were even aware of or cared about. But still, they reached this kind of nexus point where they had certainly outgrown in popularity and were certainly being more talked about than a lot of their contemporaries from within the hyperpop scene. And, there was a lot of debates as well as to whether what 100 Gecs was doing was even hyperpop. I would say fundamentally, in the core sense of what hyperpop was between, say, 2014, 2015, and 2018, that's not really what 100 Gecs is, because hyperpop is very slick, often based around a central female presence and incredibly minimal in approach. And this was totally different. This is maximalist. This is colliding together various influences from basically all of the trashiest and most uncool points of reference, and colliding them together into this monster mashup style soundscape that was there to, in the words of music journalists, provide this like, bite-sized reflection of the cultural miasma of the online world in the late 2010s. Yada, 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 all that hoity-toity shit. That's what 100 Gecs was. And that's what the 1000 Gecs album sounded like as well. Like, a lot of people know the song Money Machine. That was their huge crossover hit. And, you know, the eccentric, over-the-top vocal performance of Laura Less in particular as well spawned many "Hey You Little Piss Baby" type memes. And, you know, secondarily as well, although that was a
And
big,
it's a banger.
it is a banger. It's a fucking hardcore song. It is probably always
Mm-hmm.
going to be their definitive song, for better or worse.
Mm-hmm.
You also had, you know, for the people who were invested enough to sort of look beyond that, you also had the absolutely ballistic and hilarious ska revivalism of "Stupid Horse" as well, which was
Fucking love Stupid Horse.
amazing song.
Banger. Love
You
it.
had more, I guess, cute sounding and I guess closer to hyperpop leaning tracks like "Ringtone," which was a big on repeat song for me in that year. And you had, you know, the more ballistic and bizarro moments like 800 dB Cloud and "Hand Crushed by a Mallet." It was this really tight, concise 23-minute maximalist explosion of sound, basically. And there was not really much like it that was making the impact that it made. And I was kind of at the height of my interest in hyperpop and my fixation on artists from that world in 2019 as well. So you can bloody well believe I was all over this and simultaneously felt that it was kind of overrated, but also like definitely represented the apotheosis of everything that this sect of online culture had been building towards. So I have a lot of affection for that record, even if that hipster
As do I.
to go like, you know, there was way more cool bubblegum bass coming from, you know, the actual PC music scene or whatever. This was evolving beyond that. And that only became truer with the remix album, 1000 Gecs and the Tree of Clues, which we reviewed actually in the very early days of this podcast as well, which showed, you know, whether or not you liked it or not, we were pretty critical of those remixes, but whether you liked them or not, they kind of made obvious something that, you know, the 1000 Gecs album was kind of like forcing you to think about, which was how this basically reflected and did a lot of the same things that its reference points were doing, just in a very different, very new, very modern way. I mean, I think about the incredibly prominent features from artists like Fall Out Boy and Dorian Electra and Charlie XCX and Rico Nasty on that remix album as well. That felt very much like, okay, let's actually get involved, the people who have inspired a lot of what this is and who are working alongside this too. So that was a pretty big, you know, victory lap, basically. And then 100 Gecs kind of disappeared into the ether. And I remember, and I know because it's really funny, like the how fast discourse moves and how fast like the music cycle moves with artists like this who are like heralded as representing a moment or a change or a shift in the future of music. People are very quick to move on if the momentum isn't like really kept up. And funnily enough, like the main reason why it's taken us so long to get a proper follow-up to 1000 Gecs is not that Dylan and Laura were in a kind of creative stasis where they had no idea what to do, but primarily because it just took them so fucking long to get the samples cleared on this thing. Why we've had to wait this long for it. I mean, a lot of the songs on here have been around for a while, like Doritos and Fritos. I remember them releasing that, I want to say like a year and a half ago. It's just, or it feels like that anyway. But anyway, we're here, enough context. I always called it 1000 Gecs. That's the last one. 10,000 Gecs is here, and it is certainly more 100 Gecs. It is, you know, it is exponentially more by definition in its own title. That's what it is. But it's also a curious thing, like, because how do you follow up a record like 1000 Gecs that is so completely emblematic of its exact point in time that it couldn't have come out or wouldn't have meant as much at any other point in history, and has such a simple two-dimensional shtick that works because of how simple it is, but also implies a limitation that would suggest it is kind of just this thing that's going to pass in and out of fashion. And what that Dylan and Laura have done with 10,000 Gecs is very wise, in my opinion. They have not attempted to inflate or magnify the significance of that moment in any real way. What they have simply done is refine their skill and selection for their musical reference points and really honed their bits. Okay, and that was one of the things I loved about 1,000 Gecs, is that it's a string of really funny and really at points quite relatable and just immediate and amusing bits, right? Not really songs as much as just kind of elaborate, not even elaborate, but just kind of like elongated jokes that are something that really just put a spring in your step, basically, while you're experiencing them. And so what 100 Gecs have done with 10,000 Gecs is they have refined the jokes. Basically, they've expanded the reference points. They've obviously clearly had more money to pour into the samples that they're using and the scale of the music here. I would say there is fewer of the throwaway moments and of the general kind of rough around the edges, ragtag, bizarro interlude stuff that you had on 1,000 Gecs. Because I mean, when I think about that album, I think about like 4 or 5 core songs and a bunch of other stuff. Whereas here, I feel like each moment on this record, even if you don't love all of them, has its own kind of identity and is memorable for its own reason and kind of does its own distinct thing. And, you know, in the course of the week that this album has been out, I've come to love pretty much all of it. You know, to varying extents. There are some things I love more than others. But, you know, when I say love, what I kind of really mean is the extent to which I connect to and find these bits funny and observational. There is no profound analysis of sociocultural trends in 10,000 Gecs. There is two people who love what they do and love having fun and love celebrating shit that is very trashy and has kind of been consigned to the trash heap of history and bringing it back and forcing this public consciousness whose attention they now have to think about these things and remember when music was like this, you know, remember slang ting rhythm, remember ska, remember all of these, you know, weird bits of musical ephemera that most people have not thought about in ages, if not ever, and have a maximalist experience embedded in that landfill of cultural juice and junk, basically. And that's what that is. And that's what this is. Jake, I know you have slightly less connection, I suppose, intimate connection to this whole shtick than I do, although I'm sure you have your own stories about listening to 100 Gecs in the past as well. I'd love to hear from you what your kind of feelings were on 100 Gecs sort of ahead of this, what you think of this particular installment and their, you know, funky, funny, bizarro little excursions.
It's so difficult to quantify because not only does this music follow no rules, it feels like your connection and enjoyment to it is like it's inherently limited by a couple of things. In terms of their first album, I enjoy 1,000 Gecs about as much as anyone like me can, which is to say, a decent amount. I mean, again, I like Money Machine a hell of a lot. I love Stupid Horse. I even like stuff that's a little bit weirder, like Hand Crushed by a Mallet, like where they are clearly, there is a core to this music where I feel like Laura and Dylan understand the core components of pop songwriting to the point where they kind of, I guess I would describe this as a musical project that abuses that kind of knowledge and tries to stretch it as far as it possibly can while still resembling like what a hook is in a pop song and just sort of being able to take it as aesthetically far as they possibly can. And for whatever our thoughts were on 1,000 Gecs and the Tree of Clues, I sort of viewed that as an intermittent project that really was just meant to tide people over on, you know, what more Gecs music would be. But it also did showcase that there is a kind of malleability to this music that makes it inherently open to collaboration with other artists and also showcases that it's I keep trying to say these things in a way that that doesn't sound like I'm denigrating the music, but like it's like something you said about an album last year that you complimented, but you also said that it's not music that matters much. And I kind of feel that way very broadly about this music, is that that has no bearing on how much I enjoy it. But like when it comes to the defined actual like central ideas of these songs, in the moment it doesn't really matter. It's about the experience. It's about being overwhelmed by the fractious nature of this prismatic kaleidoscope into internet culture, is basically what it is. It's injecting yourself in the forehead with the idea of memes and memetic ideas and sounds.
How I would summarize it really briefly, like the appeal and all of what it is kind of like, it is music about community, but it is specifically the kind of community you form with people you have never met on online message boards and on Twitter and all that kind of thing, over content and interests that are utterly asinine and meaningless. And it's the kind of joy
Yes.
that comes from communally bonding over shit posts.
It evokes feelings of, you know, specifically people who grew up in our generation, who grew up with like, you know, the internet and memes and the idea. It evokes like childhood in some respects, I think. And it's art in the way that YouTube poop is art, in that there's a lot of effort that goes into the construction of editing these things and putting them together, and it's usually to be disposably laughed at, which is valuable in its own way. And I'm not trying to like that. I have to keep qualifying my statements here, is that I think that this album is, broadly speaking, successful at its goals, but it still in places leaves me wanting more. Because when you listen to this stuff, you kind of have to disengage from a lot of your critical faculties and just kind of be like, okay, how much fun do I have with this? That's literally it. That's kind of just the gauge you need to go by. It's a 27-minute long album, and you know, you just need to kind of roll with the punches. And as you listen to it more, you kind of understand what each part of it is doing, but it doesn't change how the overall experience makes you feel. At least it doesn't with me.
Yeah.
But in some respects, I think that there are lots of great moments on here that live up to the first album in many respects. I think that my favorite song on here is a great exemplary example of that, being the opener, Dumbest Girl Alive, which has an insatiably catchy hook that, I mean, again, they hammer this shit into the ground and it's fantastic. I love the vocal processing on here. It is just like, it's completely just tasteless out the ass. It's inane. It's stupid as hell. I love listening to it. Then there's the song after it. And I feel like these two songs are completely like this kind of dichotomous relationship that the album has with itself is a perfect representation of how I feel. Is that 757 is a fine song. I think that it accomplishes what a 100 Gecs song is supposed to accomplish. That said, to me, this and a couple other songs on here do kind of feel like Gecs on autopilot, where it kind of just feels like the everything in the kitchen sink approach just sort of leads to there being moments on here where I'm just kind of like, I can't really get into the groove or the swing of this. It doesn't like hit with the same impact. And I feel like it should. It's an album that's about oversaturating you with moments like this. And 757, it just kind of like hits that hook over and over again, but it's a little bit more muted than something like Dumbest Girl Alive and the subsequent track, Hollywood Baby, which I also think is similarly fantastic. The first real wrench that's kind of thrown into this whole album is Frog on the Floor, which is by some margin, I think, the stupidest song this band have ever made, and that is exactly why it's great. It's a fucking hyperpop ska punk song with Laura Les doing literal ribbit sounds and talking about a frog and being nice to the frog and everybody seeing the frog and, you know, the frog being at a party
and doing a keg
thinking
stand.
that the frog is super cool. And yeah, exactly. And thinking that the frog is cool and that you should take care of the frog. And you know what? This is the exact kind of inane, saturated stupidity that I totally look for, but it's backed up with like a genuine, like, there's a groove to this song that I feel like is essential to any component in something like the last Jeff Rosenstock album. Like this, you could
Yeah.
put this on something like that, and like Jeff Rosenstock could sing over it, and it would be badass and cool. And then there are moments that just kind of capture me a little bit less, where it's like I just don't really know what's being gone for. I either don't know what's being gone for, and it leaves me a little bit in the dark in terms of what I get out of the song, or it just kind of feels like the Gecs on autopilot approach just yields a bit less like it does on, I mean, a lot of people seem to really like this song, so I feel really bad saying it, but Doritos and Fritos is just kind of a song that feels like it doesn't know what to do with itself and just kind of repeats itself over and over again. And I feel like that criticism is stupid, because all the other songs on here do this the same way, but on here it feels slightly more mind-numbing in a way I don't find like fun or interesting. It's just kind of like going through this hook over and over again, and the instrumental is just kind of like, I just don't really get much out of the bounce here. And I think the moment that leaves me in the dark the most is just, I just don't understand what $1 million is.
$1 million. $1 million. $1 million.
This is 2 minutes where I am sitting there and I'm just like, I don't like this. I don't dislike this. I just don't know what this is.
You know what? Fair enough. I want to tell you a very quick story about this song. First time I heard it, I was like, I was grooving, whatever. I was like, this sort of synth thing, this I recognize that. And I couldn't place. I was like, what song have I heard this exact kind of purring synth in? And I was thinking about it for like the entirety of the song. And it wasn't until like the very end of the song that I realized what I've heard this in is that it is a preset sample in a DAW that I have used to make my own songs when I was a teenager. It is like a really basic synth preset that the exact same synth preset I once included in a song I made when I was 16. And similarly, I put a distortion filter on it. I made everything really, really loud. And I had a really, like, frankly, way more ingratiating, distorted guitar sample on top of it as well that sounded, frankly, horrific. And maybe someday I will tweak that and post it as my own 100 Gecs shit post. So I had an immediate weird affinity for this little moment purely because it actually sounded a lot like something I had made myself as a teenager. I'm not saying it's high art, or obviously I'm not saying that. I'm not even saying it's one of the best things on the album. It's probably my least favorite track on the record, frankly. But there was this weird moment of like personal connection I had to it when I recognized that it represented or kind of celebrated the same kind of like pure, innocent, unadulterated fucking around that I had once done in my own pursuit of music. So I'm not saying that
it
to
doesn't
like,
help.
yeah.
It doesn't help that it comes right after another highlight on the album in the form of Billy Knows Jamie, which
Billy
is
Knows
a Limp
Jamie.
Bizkit
Jamie's
song
got a
if I
gun.
didn't
Jamie's
hate.
gonna kill me. Think I need to run.
You should have seen the look on my face when the lyric "everybody shot" ends up in a mop, and it basically sounds exactly like when I made fun of the last Limp Bizkit album when I suck harder than a towel. It sounds exactly the same. It's exactly the fucking same. And you know what? This is exactly the format for dumbass new metal that I would want. Like, this is them executing the Limp Bizkit formula without Fred Durst to its maximum effect, and as a result having a ton of fun and getting to absorb all of the things that potentially make that music interesting and fun and invigorating. And it doesn't last all of that long either, so it feels like a legitimate like diversion that actually yields something cool and fun, and it just manages to evoke that kind of, it's kind of like what you talked about in that with Skrillex a couple of weeks ago, and that was music that when it came out was really torn apart by tastemakers and is kind of maybe due perhaps for a bit of a reevaluation just because it went very under-examined at the time. And I feel like 100 Gecs is basically that's their palette, is that they're taking things that 15 years ago tastemakers would have ripped apart because of course they would have, and then combining it together into this collage of fucking bullshit, and then trying to sort of string its most compelling moments together. And for the most part, I think that they effectively do that. And I'd say that the biggest critique of this album that I have is that besides the occasional interesting genre dalliances that they have that weren't on the first one, is that it feels a bit like a like a horizontal move for them as artists. But that's the thing, is that I don't really know how they're supposed to move on to another. Like, I don't know how you up the stakes or how you show a creative progression from one Gecs album to another. I legitimately have no idea. I don't know if it's even possible. I don't know if they want to do that. I don't know if it's something that interests them. I don't even know if that's something we'll ever get. But the point is that it does feel like I'm getting more of what I got before. And it is interesting enough and diverse enough to work and to be immediately satisfying and to have fun with it. But at the same time, I just feel like there is a potential here, but that potential is so nebulous that I can't wrap my head around it.
I mean, look, without wanting to denigrate that perspective, which is absolutely valid, I think the moment this clicked for me was the moment I was, I guess, mentally able to like accept and view the album through the framework of progression doesn't matter. Really, it's just how good are
No,
the bits. And, you know, some of the bits work for you, some of the bits don't work for you. That's probably a pretty universal experience, I would say, with this. You know, it is of its a certain nature where, you know, if you are of a certain mindset, you'll be able to just get completely on board with the full-throated maximalist, you know, whatever goes works thing of it. Or certain things will make you laugh, certain things won't, and that'll be it. Or the whole thing will sound like noise to you. And I kind of love it. I think it is a more satisfying front to back listen than their first album for reasons I've kind of already elucidated. But also, it feels like as individual performers, Dylan and Laura have increased in their confidence, and there's a little bit more variation in the way that they present themselves. Again, the instrumentals that Dylan has pulled together certainly benefit from a little bit more production value and a little bit more just details to kind of pick apart and recognize when you listen to it. I mean, I'll start with Doritos and Fritos, since that's a weird one. Not one of my absolute favorites either, but one that I find really funny and enjoyable for a lot of stupid reasons. First of all,
the Danny DeVito line does get a chuckle out of me.
I mean, that's just, I mean, who wouldn't? But first of all, the fucking Primus ass bass line in this song, which literally
Yeah.
sounds like the string is being like rubbed against a wooden panel and plucked. It is just the worst sounding bass tone in the entire world. It is dog shit, but it is sharply produced dog shit bass tone. Reminds me so much of Les Claypool, but like just with a kind of self-awareness that, I mean, Les Claypool has some sort of has self-awareness. You don't call an album Sailing the Seas of Cheese if you don't have it. But you know, it's kind of just taken further through the looking glass, which I really, really appreciate. Yeah, the chorus is weird and kind of like confronting in a way that the energy of the rest of the song, it kind of feels like it interrupts it, but I still enjoy that a lot. I think the first four songs are impeccable, frankly, and a lot of it comes down to the delivery and the personality that comes through as well. Like Laura is just insane on Dumbest Girl Alive. Like every single bar that she drops in the song is
So
iconic.
good.
If you think I'm stupid now, you should see me when I'm high and I'm smarter than I look. I'm the dumbest girl alive. Like that's just, those are, you know,
Text.
I don't know if kids in school still do yearbooks now, if that's still a thing, but if it is, then that would be someone's yearbook line. Like I'm
It
smarter than I
should
look.
be.
I'm the dumbest girl alive. I I've got lightning in my veins, walk around like Frankenstein. I did science on my face. I'm the dumbest girl alive. Like that's just like fucking facts, honestly. And yeah, I really, I think the energy keeps up for me with 757. Really enjoy that. I like the sort of staccato vocal delivery that's processed to feel like it's, like these tiny little, micro notes. It has this kind of like cascading, glissando effect. I don't really have the musical terminology to describe it well, but it's funny and it kicks ass, and I really like it as well. Live in dog years and I feel 26. Yeah, I'm old bitch, but I learn new tricks. Better learn quick or end up like green bricks. You say you smoke real trees, those look like little sticks. We don't smoke trees, we smoke tree-sized dicks. I can't fault any of these. These are bars. Like, told the devil he's a lemon, go off. Like, who would write that? Hollywood Baby is, I think, like the most fully formed, I guess, song on the whole album. It feels like the record's money
Yeah.
machine in a certain sense, and that they've purposefully and very deliberately put a little more effort into like fleshing this out in a way the other songs don't need, but this certainly doesn't hurt to have. Every part of this is
No.
really, really catchy and really, really funny. There's actual like, not that I'm saying, that 100 Gecs need this, but there is actual kind of substance to the commentary on the song. I mean, a lot of it, of course, is talking about their move to Hollywood, obviously their move to Los Angeles, and the way in which that landscape is kind of seeping into what they do. Obviously they're very much of the online world as well, but the particular kind of, famously cold and cynical world of Los Angeles kind of bleeding into their artistic personas and the way they view themselves. There's a little bit of that kind of, typical artistic anxiety of purpose and meaning that comes through in a lot of sophomore efforts after really celebrated debuts that feels like it's addressed in this song enough for me to feel satisfied about the band's lack of progression, I suppose. Frog on the Floor is just hard as fuck. There's no, I mean, it's not.
Mhm.
It's one of the softer songs in the album, but it's fucking.
Yes.
It's just awesome as shit.
It's hard in spirit.
It is. Billy Knows Jamie is like absolutely my favorite thing here. And it is that for a few very key reasons. And because I can kind of relate it to a number of aspects of my experience online and the things that we immerse ourselves in on Twitter. I specifically described it as the logical endpoint of the crazy moments in new metal historyification of 2000s trash revisionism. That's what this song
Yes.
is. Everything that crazy moments in new metal history does, and everything that Twitter account represents. And I think it represents a lot of things that are maybe a little bit more profound about our current culture than you might think, is kind of encapsulated in what this song is, which is this brutal new metal revivalism that is taken so far through the looking glass that it makes even the excess of 2000s era new metal and Linkin Park and Korn, all that stuff, look kind of trivial. I mean, nowhere is that more clear than to say it's the blown out and ballistic finality of the song would be to be understating it. It truly sounds like they're trying to create something that will kill you. I can't imagine. I imagine that when they play this live, the pit opens up and fucking Satan himself reaches a hand through. That's how hard this goes.
Born by way of Merzbow.
And it's also like, again, not that it needs to be, but it's also kind of a song with some interesting commentary about stan culture within it as well, and about the nature to which people who develop a certain obsession with particular artists and have kind of parasocial relationships take that to a new extreme. It's not a serious song. It keeps that sense of silliness and spirit throughout the whole thing, but it does ultimately end in a scenario where a hyper fan is essentially committing a mass murder spree at the end of this song as well. So, it kind of undercuts you a little bit as it goes in a way that I really like. $1 million I've already kind of talked about, and the only thing I'll add to that is that it is a fun song to listen to and think about how absurd the concept of $1 million actually is when you really think about it. Low key, one of my favorite songs on this whole album is The Most Wanted Person in the United States. Part of this is
That one is so much fun.
part of this is this kind of spirit that it has. Obviously, there's the incorporation of the Sling Tang rhythm, which is a huge 90s throwback and 2000s throwback. But also there's this like They Might Be Giants-esque novelty to it that I've come to really, really appreciate. There's the just wanton stupidity of the lyrics themselves as well, which again feels like if there's a theme coming through here, there's maybe this kind of shallow commentary on what it feels like to be in 100 Gecs and the kind of irony poisoned humor that you now need to mine for, like, it's knowing that your irony poisoned humor that is, you know, just the focal point of your friendship and your group chats online is now this thing that music journalists and serious magazines like Rolling Stone are talking about as if it's meaningful. And this is kind of feels like it's commenting on that a little bit, as well as also talking about having Anthony Kiedis sucking on your penis, which is just
Yep.
an image I now have in my brain.
The thing that this song reminds me of, and I hate to say it just because it's a very like stupid comparison that a lot of people make very shallowly, but like the delivery here really reminds me of Death Grips, honestly.
There's a
Like
little bit of
the
death
spoken
grips in
word
here
here,
for sure.
yeah, like not the sonic elements of the song, just like it sounds like the spoken word that would be delivered on like the front half of like the powers that be or something. And then like it would be some extreme noise thing that would
Yeah,
happen right after.
you could
Like there's
imagine
a sinisterness.
there's always that's the thing with Death Grips albums is that like the most chilling moment on any Death Grips album is when MC Ride does clean spoken word vocals. Like
He's
no
just like,
matter what,
yeah.
when he's
You're like,
just
what?
talking to you, that's way scarier than when he's screaming. And I get
Yes.
what you mean. And there is also like the exact same like sample that they used on 800 dB Cloud off of the first album of MC Ride going, yeah, is also on She Knows Jamie as well, like a bit of a throwback. That's one of my favorite things they do. Like every time I hear them use the yo, I just lose it. It's just impossible not to gut bust.
Great.
I want to shout out the many multiple allusions and celebrations of ska on this record. I Got My Tooth Removed being the most kind of like full
Yep.
throated of them all. Ridiculously fun song. I love the anecdote of Laura Less introducing this at a show and kind of building it up and saying, "Here's a song we just wrote. It's about when I got my tooth removed." And then like that's explaining the song that then says I got my tooth removed about 45 times. And that really
The
sums,
horns at the end of this are spectacular.
yeah, just incredible. Again, like, and you get to like 3/4 of the way through the song and it's basically done every ska staple except the pick it up, which it then does, which is just perfect. Again, amazingly pig-headed but just stupidly brilliant lyrics from Laura here. My head's like a ton of bricks, but this dumb bitch still learns new tricks. I fucked with fire, burned my dick playing violin on sinking ships. I love my favorite line here. I woke up and was down horrendous. Just so funny to have someone say that as a song lyric. And it really does. I mean, like, look, all jokes aside, if you've ever experienced like a proper toothache, the feeling of that is really captured in this song. Like to the point where Laura talks about being willing to get down on her knees to make the pain go away. Like you would do anything. No one has any dignity when they have a toothache. And
It's true.
real shit. And then Me 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 is a fun little closer. Not one of my favorite songs in the album. I feel like the repetitive vocal looping is kind of just done a little bit better on 757, but I do like the song still. It has that kind of good closer energy, and of course thematically as well. It's kind of like a final little fuck you, full stop on the parasocial themes that the album's kind of talked about of like people finding, I guess, affinity or communion in Dylan and Laura and them just wanting to say, please go away, basically, which, I can relate to. And yeah,
Seeing as how you are internet famous.
I was going to say something to preempt that, but, hey, look, every so often I get someone in my replies that I like, wow, I don't even want to talk to this person. Whereas when you join Twitter and someone replies to you, it's an event. And now you get to a certain point and you're like, who are you? Oh. So yeah, I can relate on that level. I'm not famous. I don't want to be. I will never be. If I do become famous, then I will immediately do whatever I can to stop becoming famous. Probably not. Maybe I'll probably change my mind. I'll probably sell myself out. I'll probably do things I would regret. I'm going to stop talking now. Let's finish this album review and move on to something different. My favorite tracks on this are Dumbest Girl Alive, Billy Knows Jamie, and The Most Wanted Person in the United States. Least favorite. I guess it's $1 million, but again, for reasons I've stated, that song just puts a smile on my face. 8 out of 10.
My favorite tracks are Dumbest Girl Alive, Frog on the Floor, and Billy Knows Jamie. Least favorite is $1 million. And I give it a 6 out of 10.
Beautiful. Let's move on now to the second of our main reviews today, which is for the new album from Yves Tumor. Praise the Lord who chews, but which does not consume or simply hot between worlds. And I'm probably just going to call it that in the title crawl thing of the video, because he said I could do that in the title. This is the new album from one of the biggest names, and I guess it's weird to say that Yves Tumor is probably one of the biggest names in alternative rock music, or at least whatever alternative rock music is right now, which is a very different thing to what it has been in the past. Started out very much as a bedroom project, and Jake, I'm sure you can give a little bit more context on how the project has evolved since then. All I will say is that I became aware of this particular project with the album Safe in the Hands of Love, which I think is still my favorite thing that they've put out, just because its particular blend of very 90s house influenced electronics, industrial qualities, and this general sense of creeping paranoia is a particular fusion that made it one of the most exciting albums of the year it came out, and still really stuck with me. But they've evolved in very distinct ways since then. They have really upped the production value, and with that has come really strong plaudits and a lot of success for them. Jake, why don't you give us an overview of Yves Tumor and lead into this new particular record?
Yves Tumor is a musical project that is multiple people are involved, but it is mainly spearheaded by one Sean Bowie, which is a fantastic name when you consider the influences that come into their music later on, and the type of artistic persona that they've chosen to adopt. But Yves Tumor honestly has one of the most fascinating musical progressions that any artist who came up in the 2010s have. They started off with 2015's When Man Fails You, which is this very minimal kind of sound collage, hypnagogic, post-industrial thing. It's a very ambient, very low kind of stakes project. And if you heard it and just had no context for it, you probably wouldn't think that much of it. It has some interesting sound play and some semi-interesting ideas. There are elements of field recordings on here that are interwoven in a kind of interesting way, but it's just something that doesn't inherently draw a lot of attention to itself. And with each successive release that Yves Tumor put out, it seems like they have assimilated more and more and more to their sound with each successive release. After that, 2016 Serpent Music saw way more of a defined sound, in that it is kind of a combination of the post-industrial hypnagogic sound from before that's combined with a sort of art pop that's very, very avant-garde and not immediate at all, but still nonetheless feels like it is a sound with a lot more definition and a lot more direction. And after that, there's 2017's Experiencing the Deposit of Faith, which is very similar, but I just think is a refinement, a sharpening of those previous ideas into something that sounds a little bit more coherent. And as Riley mentioned, 2018 yielded Safe in the Hands of Love, which was the first album from Yves Tumor that I heard. And actually, because of the eclectic nature of this band and this project, it took me years to realize that Heaven to a Tortured Mind, the project that came out after this, and Safe in the Hands of Love were in fact from the same people at all, because I had heard Safe in the Hands of Love at the recommendation of someone years and years ago, the year it came out, and I just remembered, like, I didn't remember the name of the artist who put it out, I just remembered going based off of the recommendation of somebody I knew, and I really enjoyed it. It was confounding to me just because I was, again, far less musically literate then, so it had even less of a precedent for me than it did someone like Riley. So listening to this was just so out of nowhere, but there's a lot more here that, again, it's a lot more art pop, a lot more of the accented hypnagogia. There's just again, more of an industrial kind of blemish to this album, but there's a really full sound, a really rhythmic kind of R&B flavor to a lot of the songs on here that feels very purposeful. And I think Safe in the Hands of Love is an amazing album. I re-listened to everything that they've made this week, and I listened to it in order, so I got a sense of their progression a little bit more. And this Safe in the Hands of Love really feels like the first major statement from this group, this artist. And I really feel like it's a very rewarding record. If you haven't heard it, I highly recommend doing so. Just, prepare yourself for something that maybe challenges some of your more straightforward sensibilities. But then, in a very strange move, in 2020, we got Heaven to a Tortured Mind, which is an album that, upon first hearing it, I certainly didn't give it the attention that it deserved. And because at least at the time, I didn't really have a precedent for it and didn't really know that much about Yves Tumor, there's a lot of the things about this album that aren't necessarily immediate to a first time listen, that there's a lot of aspects and subtleties to this record that are a bit avant-garde in a way that previous records from them aren't, because it's a very different kind of thing. Heaven to a Tortured Mind certainly does have aspects of the strange, eclectic art poppiness that the previous records had before, but if I had to broadly describe what the sound of this album was, it would be The Flaming Lips does Prince. It's a very different kind of record that focuses on this glammy, neo-psychedelic thing, and it basically ends up being a more straightforward release, but still, when you compare it to other records of its kind, it is still very different. And as a result, I liked it upon first hearing it, but as I listened to it more and more, I slowly began to understand a lot more of it, and it slowly became one of my favorite records ever. One of my favorite records of the year, and something I have come back to time and time again, something I find endlessly rewarding. It's a really tightly designed record. It's less than 40 minutes, but all of it feels really, really immediate in a way this music hasn't quite felt, with songs like Gospel for a New Century or Medicine Burn or Kerosene. These are songs that feel like they come from 100 years in the future, and this neo-psychedelic glam rock that's accented by these deep fried guitars that are enormous, these very strange vocal performances from Bowie that are androgynous and weird and seductive and strange, and lyricism that, again, has always been very odd with this artist. On Safe in the Hands of Love, it deals a lot with anxiety, it deals a lot with identity, it deals a lot with interpersonal relationships, and broadly speaking, Heaven to a Tortured Mind is kind of a shattered portrait of a breakup album. It's a very odd take on the fallout of a relationship and attempting to recollect that relationship, but if your brain was broken into a million pieces. And as a result, it ends up describing this relationship as if it were like a biblical plague. And it's a fascinating album. I cannot promise that any select listener will enjoy that album as much as its biggest fans do, but I can certainly say it's a hell of a grower. So needless to say, I was really, really intrigued at the prospect of a new Yves Tumor album, because are they going to double down on the sound that they capitalized on with Heaven to a Tortured Mind? Are they going to go back and explore more of their more idiosyncratic roots? Are they going to take a complete left turn and do something completely new? I have no idea. And I can certainly say that because I knew what kind of project this was and what kind of album this was, that I was able to devote enough of my time to have a good grasp on how I feel about the record, and at least develop my thoughts on it in the broadest sense of the word, and that I knew that this needed attention, that this needed devoted listens, and I needed to inform myself with this band's back catalog to fully understand it, so I could sort of speed run to where I was with Heaven to a Tortured Mind within the span of a week with this. And I can't promise you that I've gotten there yet. But what we have here is a very strange combination of basically the sound that we had before and also what I would broadly describe as post-punk influences on here. It seems that 2023 is the year of bands that weren't previously that post-punk inclined taking on this sound and then doing really weird, interesting things with it. And all across this record, it does have more angular slanted production. There are moments on here that directly evoke post-punk classics, like for example the second song Lovely Sewer has a sample of The Cure's 100 Years on it in the drum sampling. There are moments on here like Operator, which sound like a Susie and the Banshee song from hell. There are songs like Parody that just sound I can't even really describe. It definitely sounds like the Flaming Lips if they made a post-punk song. But there is so much conflicting sounds, textures, genres on here. It's a lot of neo-psychedelia that coats this post-punk sound in something more energized, electric, eclectic, strange, but also hard-hitting and immediate and rockier than this band have ever been. Like the glamminess of the last album is traded for a kind of heavier immediacy and a little just more focus on the rock that's in this sound, like on album highlight for me, Meteora Blues, which is a song that every time I listen to it, I'm like, damn, this is what the Smashing Pumpkins could sound like if Billy Corgan tried, because the guitar tones in this are vast, they are enveloping, and they are incendiary. It feels like you're listening to a cut on Siamese Dream if it was engineered specifically to feel like it was setting you on fire. There are so many moments where just the production of this album makes these tunes come alive in ways that only I feel like this band would do. And that's just half of the sound of what this is doing. That's not speaking to the thematic core of this and what kind of identity as an artist Bowie is trying to inhabit on here. But as a result, I've listened to this at least once a day since it came out. And I can say with utmost certainty that I love the end result. It is basically as tightly designed as the record that came before it, but it does so many different things in so many different ways. And in my opinion, takes the kind of scattered approach that the last record had to its writing that was very much in keeping with previous records and takes a more focused, kind of guided, thematic stab at its ideas in a way I find a little bit more compelling into something that is more fascinating than anything that's come before it.
I completely agree. I think on the side of just the general sound of this and in terms of the production, I want to mention a few names of people who are involved in this record behind the scenes, whom Sean has taken great pains, I'm sure, to recruit these particular people because they have immense pedigrees and no doubt contribute in huge ways to this record having the vastness that it has, having the absolute immaculate sense of scale and scope and of just fullest realization of these sounds as humanly possible. You have Noah Goldstein as the producer, who is most famous for the extensive production work that he's done for Kanye West, FKA Twigs, for Rosalia, for a lot of the biggest names, Travis Scott, Pusha T, Coldplay, a lot, Arcade Fire, even a lot of the biggest names in music throughout the 2010s. Noah Goldstein has been involved in either mixing, producing, or engineering their music. Plus, you have, maybe even more notably, behind the boards in terms of mixing, the legendary Alan Moulder, probably one of the most heralded and recognized and significantly influential mixers of all time, responsible for all the most iconic records from My Bloody Valentine, yes, Smashing Pumpkins, 9 Inch Nails, The Killers, the most recent 2 Beach House albums, and a whole host of other music as well, like Alan Moulder. Most famously, of course, Jesus and Mary Chain, Psycho Candy, which is the kind of record that he came up basically cut his teeth with, along with Loveless. But yeah, getting a name like Alan Mulder to mix your record is a big fucking deal, because this guy is beyond significant, like one of the definitive fixtures of music production in the last 50 years, basically. So yeah, the album has the pedigree behind it. It is worth also, observing that Yves Tumor themselves is an incredibly skilled, not just performer, but producer and talent behind the boards too. This is a record with what I really love about each Yves Tumor record is that each one has a very distinct sonic palette and identity that sets the stage essentially for these raw, soul-searching explorations of various facets of the human experience, particularly as they relate to intimate relationships. And I think if I were to put a pin on the overall sort of theme of this particular record, it's basically the danger of dependence. And that's explored in a lot of different ways, I think, and a lot of different contexts for dependence. That can be the context of a dependent relationship as well, something which is talked about in some of the earlier songs on this record as well, like Lovely Sewer, for instance. And the title, of course, alludes to God and the idea of a religious figure or a figure of worship or a figure who can provide answers essentially for the world's unknowable things or for the anxieties in your own life. That particular idea is something that Sean is interested in exploring throughout this record as well. The post-punk aesthetic influence, I think, is definitely pronounced and distinguishes this, I suppose, from the more glam funk rocks aesthetic of the last record. And I like that as an evolution as well. I like the way in which, as Yves Tumor evolves musically from project to project, they still bring along elements of previous projects and previous incarnations of the band. So, for instance, one of the things that first attracted me to them was how good they were at integrating rhythms and electronic elements that reminded me of 90s dance music. And that's still here as well. I mean, the lead single was Echolalia, which is the most dance music song here. Basically, It has this really kind of funky groove that I absolutely adore. And you have songs like Fear, Evil, Like Fire as well, which feels even dancier and even more kind of like relating, of course, the worlds of punk to the world of dance and electronic music, as they were both intimately related in the 70s as well. So I love those elements a lot as well. I think Lovely Sewer, particularly with the guest vocalist, who I'm sorry, I don't know who that is, but whoever they are is doing amazing work on that particular song.
Amazing voice.
Meteora Blues is absolutely the biggest standout here for me. That massive distorted guitar is nailed perfectly. A lot of chatter has been circulating around the song Heaven Surrounds Us Like a Hood, which is the big centerpiece of the album and feels particularly like one of the most cathartic songs that I think this particular artist has ever produced. And then, of course, that is matched in intensity and in beautiful grace note fashion by closer Ebony Eye as well, which brings the whole thing together beautifully. This is certainly something that has had to grow on me. I know I feel like I say that every week, like, oh, the first time I listened to this, I didn't like it as much. But that was like, there was a particularly pronounced experience I had with this, really getting to adjust to the shift that Yves Tumor has made here and the way in which they've recontextualized what they do. And I think getting a bit of a broader understanding of some of the themes that are underlying this as well, like the theme of dependence in the context of interpersonal relationships as well. But there's a lot of exploration of identity and how you navigate identity and the way that your identity changes. I think a particularly interesting theme for non-binary artists, and of course, for those who don't know at home, I say this as a non-binary person as well, is the way that the idea and the theme of identity, as it is explored by artists, has this inherent meta layer to it, where as you write about your own struggles with personal identity in your life, or not necessarily struggles even, but just like the nature of your evolving relationship with your own identity in life, there's always going to be a meta level to which that is reflected in the idea of artistic identity and the way that has a kind of certain level of pressure on it to evolve by nature of the way in which artists are seen and consumed. And there's this interesting dichotomy or dynamic that exists when you're having art that's being produced about a fluid relationship with identity. That is this meta aspect of the evolving artistic identity as well, and the way in which a lot of non-binary or genderqueer or just generally not conventionally conforming artists can draw parallels between their own experiences with their own identity and the way in which they navigate artistic identity as this ever-breathing, ever-evolving process. You could even take that a step further and say that in some respects, non-binary artists are particularly prepared inherently for the nature of an artistic identity by having already experienced a fluid or changing notion of your own identity internally, if that makes any sense. So yeah, I think that I don't have more detailed or pronounced thoughts on how identity is explored necessarily yet, although I think in songs like Parody and Ebony Eye it comes through particularly strongly as well. I also want to shout out In Spite of War, which is a really short song that I really love. I just adore the energy and intensity on this as well. I think that vocal talent and vocal performance has always been something that Yves Tumor, Sean, has really committed to full-throatedly. I don't know. And one of the things that I like about them is that they are probably not a very good singer, conventionally speaking. One of my
Yeah.
favorite attributes of Safe in the Hands of Love is that there are frequent moments across that record where Sean is singing and he sounds like painful, like pained
Hmm.
and painful. Like one of my favorite Yves Tumor songs of all is Recognizing the Enemy off of that album. And that song is just
Oh
pure, like
God, yeah.
wallowing and just howling, just he has this kind of really kind of raspy voice and these really elongated tones that don't sound very tuneful at all. And Yves Tumor is able to use that as a strength beautifully, I think. It may just be that I haven't spent as much time with Heaven uh, to a Tortured Mind as you have, but I felt as though there was a little bit more primary vocal presence and driving vocal, I guess, elements to this record. That again might just be the immediacy of it being the most recent one I've spent time with, but their voice felt particularly relevant here, and it was nice to see as well because the other part of their progression that we haven't mentioned is the Asymptotical World EP that came out in 2021. That was kind of a bit of a stopgap in between releases, and the song Jackie on that EP as well, which I love, and was this real moment where it felt like, yeah, you were getting these more confident vocal performances on Heaven to a Tortured Mind, don't get me wrong, but that felt like it was getting even more confident there. And here as well, that continues in spades, I think. Um, there are moments where Yves Tumor's vocal delivery, doesn't always quite hit for me. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship still with the song Operator, which I find slightly irksome in some ways, even if thematically it has this urgency underlying it, this sense of isolation that certainly contributes to the broad overarching story of the whole album, which does to a large extent revolve around this, whether it's the Yves Tumor personally or this character that they're observing, this person who has this extreme insecurity about being alone with themselves and doesn't really have a clear way of dealing with that or processing that, and as a result of that kind of latches on to either other people or their religion or their very proximal cultural environment and attempts to derive meaning from that while kind of missing the forest for the trees and losing sense of themselves. That, I think, is kind of the narrative as far as I can see it. But yeah, it's just a really, really fiery, intense, brilliant record with so much personality, so much fun. I kind of actually have come to really like that there are moments on it I still can't quite fully get on board with. Another one being God is a Circle, which again, I like the heavy breathing and I like the momentum this builds. It doesn't all quite cohere for me, but I kind of like that there are moments like that because I like that this is an artist who, despite some accusations I kept seeing around the time of Heaven to a Tortured Mind, that this was a really creative person who would kind of like not gentrified, but sort of like, tempered down their eccentricities for success. And I always felt that was a really cynical read of what they were doing. So it feels like
Oh
a lot of
yeah.
the eccentricities of their early work, if anything, are maybe slightly more pronounced here than they were on Heaven to a Tortured Mind. And I appreciate that very much. Um, yeah, I think it's a fascinating and really, really exciting album.
I need to emphasize how I also needed to let this kind of grow on me. It was kind of my intent to sort of let that process happen just because I knew that it was necessary to arrive at a more definitive opinion. And there were several songs. I mean, God is a Circle is an example that, like, that was released as a single beforehand. And the first time I heard that song, I was just like, what the hell? Like, it was a very confusing choice as a single in any respect. It was just like, not only is this a weird song, this is weird for Yves Tumor, which is even saying something. And now I've come around to that song just having this insatiable groove. Everything on here has so much momentum and just has so much forward motion in its rhythm section that it's post punkiness. It really feels like a natural fitting glove that they just sort of slip into seamlessly. And one aspect of the writing on here that I find particularly compelling is that it is about everything that you talked about, but it's also about something that Yves Tumor has been elaborating upon since they were making music in the first place, which is the idea of faith, the idea of devotion, and the idea of damnation and its proximity to God, and how that sort of, affects you in a personal way. And it's explored in sort of a different way, on more of a macro way, in something like Safe in the Hands of Love. It was a bit put to the periphery on something like Heaven to a Tortured Mind, but here it's very much the forefront, and it's married to the idea of how they talk about intimacy on their records by attempting basically to usurp this kind of pop star, this kind of musical icon status, to sort of put themselves on the same level of godliness and godhood. Because, like on the song God is a Circle, they say that their parents drilled into them from the very beginning that God sees everything. And because they are anxious and worried about the person that they're being perceived as, they can only find solace in themselves through seeking God as like a romantic partner, because finding that is someone who can see you for all that you are, can embrace you for everything, and they find comfort in that. So they attempt to sort of indulge in this artistic persona that kind of goes into debauchery on songs like Lovely Sewer or Meteora Blues. And these songs attempt to sort of anchor them to a kind of depravity and hellishness that'll put them on that kind of divine pedestal until they undergo a kind of death and rebirth in the center of the album that starts with like Heaven Surrounds Us Like a Hood, and then Operator is the attempt to communicate with the divine. And then after that, you see them communicating with a sort of being that could be angelic or demonic in nature in songs like Operator and In Spite of War. And then the conclusion that they kind of reach to at the end is that the sort of search for God as an external being is pointless, and that by indulging in this depravity, but by realizing oneself through art and this debauchery, they have become what they have sought. And then that's the solace that they find in something like Purified by the Fire and Ebony Eye and Fear Like Fire. This is a sort of song cycle partially that, like, Purified by the Fire being more of an instrumental kind of evocation of something large and divine being like woken up from within. And then Ebony Eye is this big glammy finish to it all, where you kind of embrace oneself. It's basically a search for independence. It's all about the dangers of being dependent on someone else and then falling down the sort of trappings that consume you, but be it like depression or anxiety or losing yourself in vices. And then eventually becomes about finding yourself and then becoming an individual who doesn't need to be dependent on that and finding your own strength. And I find that so compelling, especially from an artist who, up until this point, has centered their identity around being very piecemeal. Again, Heaven to a Tortured Mind is very scattered. It is intentionally, by design, very fractious. It's a kaleidoscopic album that you really have to work to put together as to what it's doing. And the same thing with Safe in the Hands of Love. That's an album that's very much about really the vibe of anxiety and how that affects every part of you, and exploring how that affects you on like a socio-cultural level. And earlier on, records like that kind of evoke these feelings, but purely texturally through just music and not necessarily lyrics by definition. So this really feels like a culmination of everything they've done as an artist in a more laser focused way. And I won't lie, those musical moments definitely take a while to grow on you, just like they did with me on Heaven to a Tortured Mind. But once I get into the rhythm of this album, that is very, very catered to what I love about the pursuit of music and finding the treasure of artistry. And I loved being able to uncover that slowly this week. This has been the most rewarding album I've listened to so far this year, and I can only imagine that it will reward me further.
Yeah, I mean, I think hearing you very eloquently explain your interpretation, or the interpretation of the album's arc, really kind of helped to kind of slot a few things into place for me, and also really highlighted just how kind of cathartic that closing track Ebony Eye is. Might actually, on reflection, even be my favorite song over Meteora Blues now, thinking about the weight and the real kind of cathartic release of what that song is actually about as well, especially with lines like, there's no cause for shame, I'm paralyzed, a glowing life, our beloved saint. Swing that refrain of swing your arms in the October era, both you and I, this sort of confrontation with, or resolution within this other aspect of yourself that represents your fears, your anxieties, your relationship to, perceived external threats that hold you and contain your identity and cage you, basically, and being able to sort of subsume them and consume them and feel a kind of divine energy running through you. Embracing a divinity within yourself and seeing yourself in a godlike manner is a beautiful way of both resolving your tension about the omniscient observance of a foreign god by situating yourself within that space, and also of kind of saying fuck you to organized religion at the same time, and its inherent negative relationship with queerness in the queer community. So yeah, I think that's incredibly powerful.
Another thing about it is that it's just, this music is so beautifully catered to being cathartic, and that it has these tense, driving, anxious rhythms on songs like Parody, on songs like Operator, that always have a build up to something that kind of explodes midway through. Like Lovely Sewer is a fantastic example of something that does that absolutely beautifully. The thing that captivates me the most about this album is that from a production standpoint, it just fucking knocks. Every song on here just sounds immaculate and has these moments that just really feel like they send you out of the earth. There's moments on something like Heaven Surrounds Us Like a Hood where it just feels like these acoustic guitar chords are just making you spiral out of whatever contained presence you might be within, and just you just fucking you just don't get instrumentals that sound this big very often. And the way that it manages to feel like it is consuming you just feels like it is perfectly in synergy with what the album is trying to do thematically.
Yeah, I think it's going to irrevocably affect the way I engage with this album going forward. And I'm really looking forward to spending more time with it and getting to have that connection and have that thematic arc really help the music to keep resonating more and more. Undeniably, one of the great and essential releases of the year so far. All right, let's do our favorite tracks.
I gotta go with Meteora Blues, one of the best songs of the year. Heaven Surrounds Us Like a Hood, and God is a Circle. This is a 9.5 out of 10. Very, very close to being higher.
Toasty. My three favorite tracks are Meteora Blues, Heaven Surrounds Us Like a Hood, and Ebony Eye. But special shout out to Lovely Sewer as well, because that's right up there. And Echolalia and Fairy Will Like a Fire. I mean, shit. It's a great album. Gets a 7.5 from me, but certainly with potential to rise as the year goes on. That brings us to the end of our main reviews episode of Jams and Tea today. Make sure you stick around in a couple of days' time for our Now episode, where we're going to be talking about new music news, shit posting in general, the music we've been listening to, and for our main topic, we're going to be talking about great albums that are shorter than 30 minutes for when you just need a bite-sized chunk of brilliance. Let us know what you think of either of the albums we have discussed today in the comments below. 100 Gecs, 10,000 Gecs, and Yves Tumor's Praise for a God Who Chews But Which Does Not Consume or Simply Hop Between Worlds. We want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your takes, your interpretations, your relationships with this music, whether it clicks, whether it doesn't, and how you feel about it overall, as well as our analyses too. Hit us up in the comments below. Let us know what's on your mind. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing if you have not already. Both of those things help us out a great deal. And if you want to go above and beyond and support us directly for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button and become a member of the Jams Tea family. Get your name in the title crawl of each video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to and talk about, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, DuPont, the miracles of science.